What's up, AP Gov classes? This is Mr. Bell coming to you live from maternity leave here. So I may look very tired. I may look worn out. I just took a 2-hour nap, but Mr. Weber has been telling me that you're ready for these YouTube videos. So what I'm going to do, instead of having them review, I'm just going to pick up where we were at in class. So we were on Unit 17. The vocab list, the notes for Unit 17 are on Canvas. I'm going to, once this is live, I'm going to send a link to this to Canvas. So you'll just scroll down to Unit 17, click on that link. You'll be able to watch this video anytime you want to once it's up there. And if you're watching this video, you probably already know that. But the reason I'm saying that is because that's what I'm going to do, hopefully, at least for Wednesday, Thursday, and probably Friday. We'll see how far we get with these on-air notes here. So, you know, the test is coming up May 10th. A lot of y'all have been asking when I'm coming back. I'm coming back this coming Monday. I think that's May 3rd. So, no, not May 3rd. I'm coming back Monday, May 7th. So, that's when I'll be back. I know that doesn't give us long before the test, so that's why I'm going ahead and doing these. And we'll still have some time to review stuff before the test. So today we're going to start out with Unit 17, which is equal protection. You know, if you need me, you can email me anytime. I may be a little slower to get back, but it's bsbell@clevelandcountyschools.org. So I want you to do well, but at the same time, I got a kid to take care of, and I'm sure you would do the same thing. So what I'll do is I'm going to do screen share. So pretty much in a minute, what you'll see is my desktop, and I'll walk you through the notes. So let's go ahead and get started here. Okay, you should be seeing what I'm seeing right now. Hopefully you are. If for some reason the screen share did not work, then you should be able to just follow along in your Unit 17 notes. You may, hear barking dogs. You may hear a crying baby. The baby's sitting right here in front of me. So I will probably maybe have to pick her up during this, but you'll just have to bear with me because I'm taking time out of my maternity leave to do this for y'all. So, okay, let's go to Unit 17. Follow along with me in your notes. You see the topic here is equal protection under the law. So the two things you have to remember about equal protection is it's found in, hopefully you remember, the 5th and the 14th Amendment. It was the Equal Protection Clause, or the Due Process Clause, was originally found in the 5th Amendment and then became its own separate law after the Civil War for the 14th Amendment. So equal protection under the law for all is the 14th Amendment. So what I'm going to do is walk you through some things throughout history that has progressed us toward equal protection. Some of this I'm not going to cover as much because it's more U.S. history stuff, but you never know what they might ask. So let's go ahead and get started with this. Equality. So we're on 17.1. That's Thurgood Marshall, the first black justice ever on the Supreme Court. You know this probably from Unit 14. Okay, let's look at natural rights. John Locke was the one who coined this term, talking about life, liberty, property. So if you see anything about natural rights on the AP Gov test, it's John Locke. Remember John Locke, the social contract, you give up certain individual freedoms to make society function as a whole, and the best example of that is taxes. But with this is a trade-off that the government does the best it can to procure your natural rights. So don't forget that's John Locke. Okay, affirmative action here. So affirmative action is when you have so many spots set aside for minority employees or minority students. If you remember in the court case, Bach versus Regents of California, Berkeley, it certified that it's okay for schools to set aside a certain number of admission slots for minority candidates. Well, in a recent case in 2003, you see here, Grutter versus Bollinger, the Supreme Court basically reaffirmed that affirmative action is still legal. They upheld it in the hiring process and college enrollment. I doubt affirmative action is going to be on here. But the big thing with that's probably not going to be this case. It's going to be that that Regents of California versus Bach. But just make sure you know what affirmative action is and why it was put into place. So let's go. We're going to talk a little bit about women's rights. Now, this is some of the stuff I was talking about. I'm probably going to go through this kind of quick. The baby's starting to move here, so y'all might see her in a second. But I'm going to go through some of this stuff kind of quick. So we know that what amendment gave women the right to vote? You should know that is the 19th Amendment. So Seneca Falls Convention. This is kind of like the Declaration of Independence for women. They got together, they signed the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments, and here you see our women's rights leaders, okay? Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and of course you probably all know Susan B. Anthony. Elizabeth Cady Stanton's kind of like the Thomas Jefferson of women's rights. What I mean by that is that she wrote the Declaration of Rights, and it was all these things that women wanted. And the big thing they wanted was the right to vote, which they didn't get till the 19th Amendment. The next thing they wanted was the right to divorce. And then after that, it was the right to own land, because they could not own land in the late 1700s, throughout the 1800s, and even through the 1900s. So make sure you know what the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments are. But beyond that, for our class, know what suffrage is, okay? So suffrage, is the right to vote. One thing you need to know, too, is if you say get an FRQ about how equal protection under the law has progressed, what examples could you use? All right, of course, you could use women. All right, you could use African Americans. And, of course, recently you could use things like Hodges versus Obergefell and gay marriage. So there's 3 groups that you could use right there. So I think that's stuff you're pretty familiar with. So let's look some more at this. Now, Lucretia Mott tied in the women's rights movement to the abolitionist movement. So they were both disenfranchised groups, African Americans, even if they were free at the time. We're talking early 1900s here. Which they would have been free at that time, because the Civil War after that ended slavery, 1865. So, just how they were disenfranchised, just because slavery was over, didn't mean, as you know, it's like immediate equality for African Americans. Unfortunately, we still don't have that in this country today. But the big thing here is Mott tied the women's rights movement with the abolitionist movement. An abolitionist is somebody who wants to abolish slavery. Frederick Douglass is probably the most famous abolitionist in American history, and he worked closely with Lucretia Mott. You all know who Susan B. Anthony is. She is to women's rights what Martin Luther King Jr. is to African American rights and the civil rights movement. She's the face of that movement. All right. Hope you guys have been doing well too. I wasn't trying to bombard you with busy work. It's took me a minute to get to this point to where I could sit here and go over this with you. My wife was in labor 47 hours. So here we go, keeping going. Temperance movement. Okay, this was kind of the kickstart or the jump start for the women's rights movement. Temperance movement is the movement to ban alcohol. It comes from the word temper, because men would often get drunk, lose their temper, beat their wives, hence the name, the temperance movement, led by the same leaders of the women's rights movement like Susan B. Anthony. Okay, so this led to the passage of the 18th Amendment, which banned alcohol and started the Prohibition era in American history, which led to like countless crime and stuff. So the 21st Amendment made alcohol legal again. Let's see. Going to talk a little bit about the Transcontinental Railroad. This railroad was built after the Civil War. It connected East Coast to West Coast. You'll learn more about that when you get to American history. But the big thing I want to touch on here is the role of immigration as far as the Chinese. So the initial wave of Chinese immigrants into this country was right after the Civil War, and they worked on the railroad as dynamite experts. Okay, they were good at calculating where the dynamite needed to be, setting off explosives, very precise. And these were very well-paid jobs, especially for immigrants, and very dangerous jobs. I mean, a lot of Chinese immigrants died doing this. But what ended up happening, they were getting this good money. And what do you think happened? They contacted their family in China, told them the opportunities they were having, the money they were making. And what ended up happening was a flood of Chinese immigrants. So in the late 1800s, the president, I'm trying to remember the exact year, I think it's like 1885, was Chester A. Arthur, and he created the Chinese Exclusion Act. Excuse me. Get a sip of Gator right here. All right. So he created the Chinese Exclusion Act. That banned Chinese immigrants from coming into the country because there was such a nativist or anti-immigrant sentiment. So what does this have to do with AP Gov? This is another example of where you can talk about a disenfranchised group or a group of immigrants that were treated poorly. With all the stuff going on between Trump and Hispanics, the test writers may want to tie that back to previous injustices of Chinese immigrants during this time. Okay, so just keep that in mind. You email me any questions you have about this stuff too. It may take me, again, longer than usual to email you back, but I will. Okay, let's see. Immigrants in the railroad continue. Another group of immigrants that worked hard on the railroad that were instrumental were the Irish. Now, the Irish were not as respected as other members of people who worked on the railroad. Big reason for this was because they weren't doing a lot of manual labor. They would set up kind of like carnival towns as they laid track and set up things like prostitution rings, bars, casinos, things of this nature that would be more for entertainment than they would be putting in physical labor. Where you had former Confederates, not recently freed African Americans, and the Chinese sticking their neck out. So this kind of divided the country. Again, nativist means anti-immigrant. Hopefully you know that. All right, nativism. Nativism, again, anti-immigrant. That's where nativist comes from. They believe that only native-born people are worthy of being citizens. This is something that's going on throughout history. It didn't start with Donald Trump, I hate to tell you, but and there was a group within the Whig Party, okay? The Whig Party was an opposition party that was anti-Andrew Jackson due to all of his extreme agendas. Part of the Whig Party was the Know Nothing Party, sometimes known as the American Party. There you go with that thing in AP Gov of saying the same thing two different ways. And basically, they wanted to stop immigration. The big thing was they were taking these manual labor jobs that people could do, and I mean, this was, fear mongering. They were pandering to a certain group, but it did help the Whigs win some elections. So I'm going to try to tie all this together here in a second. Let's talk about the Indian Removal Act. This was Andrew Jackson. What he ended up doing, let's see if I have my map here, is he relocated several Indian tribes. You don't have to remember this, but it was like let me see if I remember them, the Choctaw, Chickasaw, the Seminole from Florida, as you see. So Florida State Seminoles, and the Cherokee to Oklahoma. He forcibly removed them. He used the military to do it, very similar to how the Nazis rounded up the Jews prior to World War II. And he moved them to Oklahoma and forced them on reservations there. And the white man took all this land over here that they recently had, one of the only lands here in the eastern part or mid-eastern part of the United States that they didn't control. Okay, so here's the thing about this. The Removal Act was actually passed through Congress. That means the House signed it, the Senate signed it, and President Jackson signed it. So it's not like he said, all right, I'm doing this through executive order. This is a good example of a controversial piece of legislation that is also some type of social injustice. It's targeting a specific group. So where do you think that something like this may go? If you guessed the Supreme Court, you would be right. More on that in a second. One big thing here to remember is the Indian Removal Act is the actual law. The Trail of Tears is the process by which the natives traveled from wherever they were at to Oklahoma Many of them died on the long journey. A very, very sad moment in American history. So here's another important thing for us as far as AP Gov. This is really the only time in American history that an American president has blatantly ignored the Supreme Court. Okay, so there is an Indian in Georgia, last name, you guessed it, Worcester. He sues, they expedite the case to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court Chief Justice, which you remember is the leader of the Supreme Court, is a guy named John Marshall, who strengthened the federal government, very influential Supreme Court justice. And John Marshall rules, and the other justices rule, that he can't do this. It's unconstitutional to force these Indians off of their land just because he wants the land. It's targeting a specific group. So they say he can't do it. Andrew Jackson, who is Trump before Trump, says, all right, I can't do it, but what are you going to do to stop me? His famous quote, as you see here, is Mr. Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. Mr. Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. What do you think that means? It basically means, all right, you told me I had to do this, but what are you going to do about it? I'm the commander-in-chief of the military. If I want to move these natives, I can. All right. So this isn't the end of mistreatment by the American government to Native Americans. Let's talk about some of these specific examples of that mistreatment. We'll go to Indian Wars here. That's an old RG3 picture there. Okay. Hopefully I'm not going too fast, but you can always rewind it. So why did the Indians struggle so much post-Civil War and building in the Transcontinental Railroad? Well, the natives were reliant on the buffalo. They used the buffalo for everything, okay? They used it for shelter. They dried the skin out to build teepees. They used the bones for utensils. They sharpened the bones for weapons. Of course, they ate the buffalo. They used the fur for clothing. It was a sacred animal for them. And what ended up happening was that these migration, roaming patterns, and even mating patterns of the buffalo had been passed down from generation to generation. So they could track these buffalo in their sleep during mating season. Sleep is something I haven't had much of with a newborn baby. I just woke up from a 2-hour nap. I think my wife's taking a nap now. But anyway, so when the railroad was built, it ended up screwing up the migration patterns of the buffalo. And a lot of the Indian tribes had trouble getting food. So they had a vendetta against the U.S. government. They called the Transcontinental Railroad, the train on it, the Iron Horse. They thought it was this giant evil being that they needed to basically fight with bows and arrows and eventually guns. Don't think the Indians were fighting with, spears, tomahawks, and bow and arrows all the time. They were, but by the time you get post-Civil War, the Native Americans, which is the politically correct way to say it, were using firearms, just like our military was. Now, they didn't have as much. Okay. Here's a big part for us as far as legislation. There is something called the Dawes Act this passed, the Dawes Surveillance Act. And here's what ends up happening. I'm going to go back to this map earlier. So the Indian Removal Act moved these tribes to Oklahoma, which wasn't a state yet. But, well, guess what? The white man, the government decides they want Oklahoma, so they're going to move them out of Oklahoma. Here's what happened. They established themselves in Oklahoma. It was very nice. They were thriving in Oklahoma, the Indians were, which was Jackson made that case to sell them, to move them there, as far as selling the Congress with the Indian Removal Act. But now, post-Civil War, they want to remove the natives to these crappy places, like where it's cold all the time, like North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, basically a pit of nothingness and despair. So the Dawes Act moves the Indians from Oklahoma to reservations like in the Dakotas, Montana, Wyoming. If you've ever looked at, like, these Indian reservations are awful. The weather's awful. They're not kept up real well. Crime's like insane on them. So not the best of circumstances, to say the least. But the Dawes Act, or the Dawes Surveillance Act, created that reservation system. So throughout history, native tribes have banded together to try to fight the U.S. government, try to fight the white man. Well, they wanted to do it one more time. There was a brave leader, Chief Joseph. Now, Chief Joseph isn't, riding in blazing war here. He is would be a strategist at this point. As you can see, he's kind of old here. But they try to get Chief Joseph to fight the United States government, the military, and he knows they can't win. So he has a famous quote. He says, "I will fight no more forever." And he takes his tribe, the Nez Perce Indians, and moves them to Canada. So this is basically an entire group of people that were the original inhabitants of America, basically losing all hope, packing up and leaving. Why is this the case? I'll tell you why. All right, we're going to look at a few Indian battles. I'm going to go fast through this one because it's really not going to help us any. It's a big part of U.S. history. Battle of Little Bighorn. This was one time the natives scored a big win against the U.S. government, the U.S. military. General Custer was in South Dakota looking for gold. He found gold on an Indian reservation. He wanted to attack the reservation. He telegraphed back to Washington. They said, "No, wait for reinforcements." He was an idiot. He went in there anyway. By the way, he kind of looks like Matthew McConaughey, don't he? All right. All right, so what ends up happening is he goes in there. He's outnumbered. There's this brave, young chief in his prime called Sitting Bull, a Sioux Indian chief, and he basically tears them up. Not Custer, Sitting Bull. He kills Custer. And Custer's last stand, he fought bravely through a sneak attack, which is kind of hypocritical. But even though he was outnumbered, which he wouldn't have been if he would have listened, what ended up happening was he got killed. So, I mean, I know I didn't do the best job explaining that, but I just don't want us, to waste too much time here. So let's move on to these other Indian battles. So I'm going to go through a series of Indian battles here in the form of Sand Creek and Wounded Knee. I'm telling you about these battles because you could use these as specific examples of a social injustice or an injustice orchestrated by the U.S. government toward a certain group. In this case, that being Native Americans. All right, so let's look at Sand Creek. What happened at Sand Creek? This story is actually referenced in Iron Man 3, by the way, by the Mandarin. Okay, what happened in Sand Creek was there was the same type of thing. You had these exhibitions by these U.S. military coalitions led by usually pretty decent generals. The general in this one is General Shavington. This takes place at a creek in Colorado. So they're looking for gold. They don't find any, or other natural resources too that they're afraid the Indians may have on their land. So they're looking for that, and they come across this massive, not massive, but a pretty big Indian encampment at Sand Creek. Well, the Indians know they're outmatched, they're outnumbered. Beyond that, what they call the braves are the warrior Indians, the males, the hunters, the fighters in their prime were out on a hunting expedition. So it was mainly older Indians, women, and children. So they literally fly a white flag of surrender. And the U.S. military, led by General Shavington, goes in here and executes, slaughters every one of these Indians, women, children. It's just an awful, awful sight. One of the worst parts of American history, and one of the worst things our military, if not the worst thing our military has ever done. So, again, you can use this as an example. Okay, Wounded Knee. I love teaching this one in class. I hate them, not there to teach it. But kind of the same story. I think Wounded Knee is in Montana. I could be wrong. That's just off the top of my head, but same type of story. The U.S. government, the U.S. military encounters a run up on a big Indian reservation, and they kind of stake it out. They scout it out. They see an Indian chief doing a ceremonial tribal dance. And what ends up happening here is they interpret it as a war dance. Well, what had happened is the elder chief had died and it was actually a ghost dance. But since they interpret it as a war dance, they go in here, they take it over. They don't slaughter them right away. Okay. They disarm them. So they line the Indians up in a row and they begin taking all their guns from them. They get about 3/4 down the line. There's an older Indian who is next to his grown son, and he kind of begrudgingly doesn't want to give up his gun. It goes off accidentally. I guess the safety wasn't set, and they mow them down in firing squad. They kill every single one of the Indians at Wounded Knee. There was nothing at Wounded Knee, and they moved on. This book, A Century of Dishonor, written by Helen Hunt Jackson, was a book that laid out all the injustices perpetrated toward the Native Americans from Christopher Columbus to Sand Creek and Wounded Knee. So it kind of was a wake-up call. We treated these people terribly, and this was originally their land, but by this time, it was too late. All right, we're going to go to 17.2. This stuff is kind of more beneficial to us right here. So we're going to take a little break. I'm going to stop screen share here and try to take like a little 2-minute break here. Maybe we'll play you a little music or something. Let's see. How about this? I don't even know if you can hear this. It's an ad. Be right back. Okay. All right. Let's get this started again. That was from the Infinity War soundtrack. No, I hadn't seen it. If you email me spoilers, you're going to fail the course. All right. Hopefully, I'm going to go Wednesday night. Got the Hawkeye hat here. Okay. So let's get started. We're going to go to 17.2. You probably skipped that. Sorry, just all this talking. Have to get some Gatorade. It's just a lot. I love to talk, but not this much. Okay. Let's go back to the screen share. Okay. So we're going to talk about civil rights laws here. Let's see. Hopefully you have me. We've covered the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. I'm going to review them real quick just in case you forgot them. The Civil Rights Act bans all types of discrimination, not just against African Americans, but against women, against homosexuals, against any other type of minority other than African Americans, against transgender people. Says that places like schools, hospitals, public places, the government specifically can't write laws to discriminate against one group. That's the Civil Rights Act of 64. Lyndon B. Johnson passed that. The Voting Rights Act, let's see if the baby's up here. Still asleep. All right, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, basically, this is what Dr. King marched for in Selma, and Lyndon B. Johnson also ended up passing it. Got rid of any types of discrimination that prevented people from voting in deep South states like Alabama, Mississippi, places like that. Now, this is like super important stuff, and it could be on the test. So if you don't remember it, just refer back to prior units or just look over it, Google it. But that's kind of the 101 of it. Okay. The first Civil Rights Act, though, was not the big one in 64. It was the Civil Rights Act of 1957. It's Eisenhower, and he made it a crime to prevent someone from voting in a federal election. Okay, that doesn't mean state elections, just federal elections. So U.S. Senate, U.S. House, President. You get the picture. Eisenhower was a Republican. He's an old white guy in the 50s. You probably think he didn't do much for civil rights. But after Brown versus Board of Education, he actually used government preemption to send the U.S. military to stand off against the National Guard in Arkansas on what's called the Little Rock Crisis, which allowed African-American students to enter the previously all-white high school. So you can imagine once the military faced off, they didn't fight. They came close to it with the National Guard. The National Guard and the governor of Arkansas backed down. The black kids were allowed to go into the school. So, Age Discrimination and Employment Act, LBJ again. You see he's doing a lot for groups he considers to be targeted groups or groups that have been discriminated against, such as African Americans or the elderly. A lot of this is part of his Great Society, which is beefing up all this government spending, government regulation. And some people say it created the welfare state because of its expansion of Medicaid and welfare and that kind of stuff. But we kind of talked about that already, and we can talk about it again. So this prohibits job discrimination based on age for people ages 40 through 65. Prohibits mandatory retirement. Look, this law is kind of a weird law, but prohibits mandatory retirement. They can't tell you when you have to retire. All right, they can hint you toward it, they can push you toward it, but they legally can't say when you hit 62, all right, we want you out of here by next week, buddy. You got to retire. That is illegal. Now, if you're 40 to 65, so if you're at least 40, they can't say you're too young for a position. And if you're between 65 and 40, they can't say you're too old for a position. But once you get before those ages, which I know that's kind of a very specific spot, they can tell you, you're too young for this job, you're too old for this job, so we're not going to hire you. But the big thing here is prohibits mandatory retirement. If this happens to be on the test, I'd be shocked, but we try to cover all of our bases. Fair Housing Act of 1968, Lyndon B. Johnson. Again, this is a bigger one here. So any type of discrimination when it comes to race, religion, national origin, when it comes to the selling of a house, the renting of a house, is illegal. You can't be a landlord and prevent a certain group from living on the premises. If that's the case, you'll see your day in court rather quickly. You say it gets rid of, there's a bold underline, restricted covenants. So these are provisions that discriminated based on religion when selling a home or race. They can't ask any of that stuff when you go to get your first home, your mortgage, or when you go to get an apartment in college or whatever, thanks to this act. It's not that hard to understand. It is important, though. Title IX, This is a big one right here. And it's often a confusing one for students, in particular students who are fans of like college football and college basketball, which I know is a lot of you. So let's take some time to slow down and talk about this. So this prohibits any type of discrimination based on gender and education when it comes to programs receiving federal funding. So the big thing here was college athletics. First of all, it makes universities spend equally on male and females. Okay. Nextly, athletics specifically, let's say we're at the University of, let's do Alabama. All right. They've been the best college football team here. So it is actually illegal for Alabama to decide, the University of Alabama, to decide to spend more taxpayer money on their football program than it is their, let's say, women's soccer program. Because you're favoring male over female there, which as of 1972 is illegal. But we all know that the women's soccer program in Alabama isn't getting as much as Nick Saban's football program. That's the head coach of Alabama, those of you that don't know. So football. So the question is, how do they do this? Well, any of that extra money that, like, you know, Alabama football, Duke basketball, UNC basketball gets to have these crazy training facilities, these nice courts, these nice fields, that's from donors, that's from boosters, former alumni. There's only a tad of taxpayer money paying for that, and it's got to be divided equally amongst males and females on the campus, but between male and female athletic programs. So no athletic programs getting more taxpayer money than any other on a college campus in the United States. It's illegal. They can get in big trouble if they do it. So what that means is the loophole is boosters and donors kind of paying for these bigger programs. Rehabilitation Act. Let's see this one. I don't really think this would be on there. Let's see. Federal grants greater than 25. Okay, so basically if you get free money, $2,500 a year, they want you to make sure you're pushing the hiring of handicapped workers. Handicapped workers could be a very broad thing. I don't think this would be on there. All right, let's look at the Fair Housing Act of 1988. HUD stands for Housing and Urban Development. You see it right there. All right, it was created by Lyndon B. Johnson. The current secretary of HUD is, oh my God, Ben Carson. Okay, so HUD basically prevents any type of bias against handicapped individuals. So you can't make a home that, if it's HUD, okay, HUD, and let me explain what HUD does for you to understand this, because if I don't, this won't make sense. HUD creates government housing, whether it be apartments, small houses, people who can't afford a safe and decent place to live. The government pays for them to live there, low-income housing. In any of these low-income houses, they have to be handicap accessible, much like a restaurant or something would, with ramps and things of that nature. So any housing the government helps pay for that they build, done by HUD, has to, I repeat, has to be handicap accessible. Speaking of that, in 91, George Bush, Daddy Bush, Bush 41, who just lost his wife, Barbara, a couple weeks ago, signed the Americans with Disabilities Act. This made all public places have to be handicap accessible. You go places in public like restaurants, movie theaters, hospitals, schools, there's ramps, there's elevators. A handicapped person in a wheelchair is supposed to have as much access to it as a person who is, you know, in perfectly good health. So that's pretty straightforward. This is a big one, though. Study this one, star this one, remember this one. And I'll go back through at the end and tell you what the most important ones here are, so you don't kind of, you know, go insane trying to figure out which of these do I study, which of these do I don't. I'm going to skip this one. Let's see. The Glass Ceiling Commission was a government organization or a group in Congress that basically studied why it is that women had a hard time getting hired and wasn't paid as much, and other minority candidates as well. So, I mean, it's the reason they had a hard time is because it's kind of messed up the way things are when it comes to that kind of thing. Don't worry about this one. All right, let's go to equal protection here. We're almost done. I think there's like 38 slides here. Hopefully I've emailed this to you. I got to double check. Well, let me double check and see if I did. Hold on. Let's see if I emailed y'all this PowerPoint. Let's see. Let's see. Sent. Let's see here. Okay, so y'all have been sent this, it looks like, right here. That's first period, and I forwarded it to all of y'all. Again, it's full on Canvas, so I couldn't upload it there. All right, baby's still sleeping. Okay, let's finish this here. Okay, screen share still on. All right, 17.3, equal protection. Gamillion versus Lightfoot. Supreme Court ruled that drawing of election districts to ensure that members of a certain minority in the district was ruled unconstitutional. So you can't draw a district to just have white people voting there, to just have African Americans voting there. This would be known as gerrymandering, as we've learned, and you probably learned from Mr. Mellon and other civics teachers. Okay, so 1960, the Supreme Court, Gamillion versus Lightfoot, said that you can't draw congressional lines based on race. That's what it said. Smith versus Allwright, it said that all white-only primaries in the South are unconstitutional. So this is before the Voting Rights Act, but it said that you can't just have a primary where all whites vote in it. It's kind of outdated, of course, by the time you get to the Voting Rights Act. An easy way to remember this is Smith is the whitest name ever, and Allwright looks like all white. So that's just one you got to just memorize. I doubt it will be on there. Let's see. Jim Crow laws. Plessy versus Ferguson. Let's talk about all this terrible stuff, but important stuff. So Plessy versus Ferguson created separate but equal. At the time, it was a step in the right direction, but of course, it was not a right thing to have separate facilities for blacks and whites. So that's when you got Brown versus Board of Education in segregation undoes Plessy versus Ferguson. So make sure you know that. Let's look at the types of segregation. There's what we call de jure segregation here and de facto segregation here. De jure segregation is the kind that's illegal. Black water fountain, white water fountain, black school, white school. You get the point. De facto segregation is societal norms, how we segregate ourselves. The best example of this is a black church and a white church. There's nothing that says that African Americans have to go to church with all African Americans or white people have to go to church with all white people. It's just kind of a societal norm that is the case. Okay, so make sure that you know the difference between the two type of segregation. Let's go over all these things. These were things that prevented African Americans. Hold on, I'm going to get the baby here. I'm going to let y'all see her. Hold on. She's still sleeping. Let's see if we can get through this. Okay. Grandfather clause. Basically, if your grandfather didn't vote, you couldn't vote. Obviously, in the South, most people's not, I'm not talking father here, grandfathers were slaves, so that prevented a lot of African Americans from voting. Literacy test, you had to pass a very difficult reading and comprehension test in order to vote. Poll taxes, you had to pay to vote. The 24th Amendment would ban the poll tax. The grandfather clause and the literacy test are banned by the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Make sure you know that. Grandfather clause, literacy test, banned by the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Lyndon B. J. The 24th Amendment, which is when Lyndon B. Johnson's in the White House too, bans the poll tax. Can never ask anybody, doesn't matter their race or gender, to pay to vote ever again. Jim Crow laws are separate, but equal laws are voter discrimination laws. Let's finish. There's 2 more slides, guys. Majority minority district. So basically, you can have a voting district that's mainly white or mainly black, as long as race was not the main factor in drawing these districts. A lot of times it is, which is gerrymandering, which when you draw any type of congressional districts at the state level, federal level, is automatically subject to judicial review. Let's see. Washington v. Davis. All right, this is an important one here. Supreme Court recognized the disparate impact of the 14th Amendment. So basically, here's what this means. The Supreme Court says equal laws do not guarantee equal results. Equal laws do not guarantee equal results. It goes back to procedural due process and substantive due process. Substantive due process, as you remember from last unit, is writing the laws fairly. The U.S. does a pretty good job of that for the most part post 1960s. What they do not do a good job is procedural due process, which is enforcing the laws fairly. Okay, let's go back through these. I'm going to tell you which one of these you absolutely have to know, which ones you don't need to waste your time on. All right, know that John Locke is natural rights, so star that one. Know what affirmative action is, and Grutter versus Bollinger upheld it, and so just go ahead and star that one, highlight that one. Also, remember Regents of UC versus Bach. Know the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. Know what suffrage means. You should know that if you're in AP Gov. Just know some other groups that have been targeted, such as Chinese, Irish. Don't just automatically, go toward slavery and African Americans, because that, yes, that's the biggest one. That's the one of the biggest tragedies and black eyes on American history. But they will ask you about other groups because they figure you will go to that. So they'll ask about, and they may not even ask much about women. So you can go to like Chinese, Irish, Native Americans. Know what nativism is, being anti-immigrant. Let's see. Know Worcester, Georgia was a time when the Supreme Court asked the president to stop doing something and he ignored it. So really the first and only time the president blatantly ignored the Supreme Court. I wouldn't worry too much about. Know the Dawes Act created the reservation system. All this stuff I wouldn't worry about. You got to know the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. So if you don't know that, learn it. Know the Civil Rights Act. No, I'm not really worried about this one. I'm not worried about this one. Know the Fair Housing Act. All right, star that one. Know Title IX. Star that one. Let's see. Know the American Disabilities Acts. Double star that one. Know that Bush 41 signed it in the law. Civil Rights Act. All right, let's go to 17.3. Know Gamillion versus Lightfoot. Star that one. I wouldn't worry about this one. Know all this stuff about the 2 different types of segregation. Know grandfather clause, literacy test, and poll tax. Know the 24th Amendment banned poll tax. The grandfather clause and literacy test was banned by the Voting Rights Act of 65. Triple star this one. Probably star this one. Majority minority district. Double star this one. Washington versus Davis. Okay, so there is your unit 17. Let's look at your vocab here. That's your review guide. Now, y'all should have this. Okay. Natural rights. You know what that is. We went over it in the PowerPoint. Affirmative action. Women's suffrage. Equal protection. This is an easy vocab list. Commerce clause. Okay. This clarified that the House regulates the buying and selling of goods between nations. We haven't went over that. Just memorize that. We went over that in the notes. Yeah, I think that's all pretty straightforward. Let's see. Okay. I'm going to stop the screen sharing. Hold on. All right. You want to see the baby girl? Hold on. Here she is. Baby Harper. She's probably about to get fussy. She just woke up from a nap. All right. I'm gonna feed her. All right, you can email me bsbell@clevelandcountyschools.org, and I will get back to you. Hopefully you watched all this. Hopefully you do this review guide. Hopefully you do this note card. And I wish you guys the best of luck. So you see I got my hands full. I'll let you go, and I am